Hello and welcome to my channel. This is my first video, so I thought I would introduce myself a little. I'm Emily and I'm primarily a dip pen and ink artist with a love of folklore, dark nature, animals and storytelling. Recently, however, I've been exploring doll making and small sculpts that I'm looking forward to sharing on here soon. This is the first piece I had inked in a very long time. I had sketched out the drawing months prior, but had been so consumed with other projects I had put this one to the side. Often I get a lot of anxiety before inking a piece, and it's very different from painting with oils or acrylics. If I make a mistake, it can be very hard to fix it. There are things you can do to cover up mistakes, but I still get quite nervous. Here I'm spending quite a lot of time thinking about how I want to ink this piece, what order I will place the lines in, so that I don't have any lines overlapping where I don't want them. I often go in with pencil and really think about where I'm going to place certain details before I start inking. I'm checking the nib of my dip pen to make sure it's clean, and I often press it against my fingernail to make sure it's not wearing out or getting too flexible. The more flexible it becomes, the thicker the line is, and it lets out more ink. I like to use a very, very fine nib, so I'm always worried about it wearing out. I thought I'd leave these clips in, as I often spend a lot of time procrastinating before beginning a piece, and sometimes I can drive myself a bit crazy talking myself into starting. I use Indian ink for all my drawings. I don't stick to a particular brand, although this pot of ink is Dr. P.H. Martin's, but so long as it's Indian ink, it works very well with a dip pen. This is a piece of paper I use to test out the dip pen after each time I dip it into the ink, to make sure it's not overloaded and the line is running smoothly. And it looks like I'm ready to start. Sometimes all it takes is deciding which lines I should start with and committing to it. I decided to start with the grass, as a lot of that will be covering the body of the subject, so I want to make sure those lines are inked before drawing her hands and face. At this point I decided to speed up the footage to 120%. This is the first video I've ever edited for my art, so if you have any constructive feedback, it is very welcome. I tried my best to balance showing the process while making a relaxing video that didn't leave in any unnecessary details. I also changed lenses halfway through this process video to a lens that's a bit sharper. You will probably be able to tell the difference when it comes. I find this lens right now suits my doll making and sculpting videos much better than my inking. Hair features in my work quite a lot, and I really enjoy how it creates movement within a piece. It can be quite difficult with a dip pen nib to draw this particular hair perfectly because there's lots of curves, and it can be a bit scary inking the hair and making sure that the curves of the hair are as perfect as possible. I find using less ink makes it much easier, but it does mean you have to keep redipping the nib more often. But I really like how this part of the process turned out. I think the hair has a really nice movement, and you can see here I'm being quite tentative with trying to get that curve in and using as little ink as possible so that it comes out more perfect. Here you can see I'm drawing between the blades of grass, and you can see why it's so important that I pay attention to the order that the ink is laid on the page. I do make mistakes still. I think I'm actually going to make a mistake soon. You can see here I'm drawing through the hair, which I shouldn't have done. I corrected this mistake off camera. I think in the future I'll leave things like that in. I actually use a scalpel to gently scrape the ink off the page, and then I use a soft rubber to remove any excess ink. And usually I find this can work quite well. it's quite hard to draw any ink over that surface and make it look the same. The ink tends to bleed, so that can also be quite nerve-wracking because you're essentially ruining the paper. You're having to remove paper. Another day. I find once I'm at this stage of a piece, it becomes very fluid for me. I love just immediately getting stuck into inking, and I find the process very meditative. I sort of have to have enough concentration that I'm paying attention to line quality and detail, but I'm actually also able to listen to things while I work, such as podcasts or videos. Some elements of the process, especially the penciling process, I have to concentrate a lot more because I'm thinking about correct anatomy and the overall composition of the piece, and I'm thinking about lots of small details. I'm often looking at reference photos as well, so I need to compare what I'm drawing to what I'm looking at. And actually at this stage I often find I have to work in complete silence because I have to concentrate so much. I love hands and fingers in my work, and I love to feature these all the time. I pay a lot of attention to hand positions, and I take a lot of reference photos so I can pay extra attention to the position of fingers. I actually took a pretty funny reference photo for this piece. I don't think I'll be sharing it, but perhaps that's something I can share if I ever decide to make a Patreon. I can imagine people would find that quite insightful, seeing my contorted positions. Inking the face is always quite nerve-wracking. If I mess it up, for me, the whole piece is ruined. But I try and ease my anxiety by telling myself I can always just trace the piece and start again from scratch if anything goes really wrong. I can actually spend a really long time deciding how I want a face to look. Sometimes I draw a face and I just really dislike the expression I've created or how the character looks, and it can take me a while to find the exact face I want, but I found this face came quite fluidly to me, and sometimes it just works out naturally, or you have a very clear idea of how you want a character to look before you start sketching up the drawing. I think these lines I'm drawing of the hair are really satisfying to watch. You can see I make a little mistake there on the page, and you'll see that I'll cover that up later. I wasn't too worried about it because I knew that the background is going to be very dark, and so I knew it wouldn't show up. And here you can see I'm lining the eyes very carefully. I'm always worried about overloading the nib too much with ink, but I was really happy with how these eyes came out, and getting the shape of the iris just right. It can really change the expression of the character so much. The same with the lips as well. They actually came out a bit puffier than I intended, but I quite like how it turned out, and I really like her face. And here we have the strands of hair that are being nibbled on by these angry little rabbits. This part of the piece, I was actually a bit bothered by the amount of grass I put under her chin, and it's a bit more obvious once there's more ink and shading. I think it would have looked better with a bit less. But it's been a while since I had looked at this piece, and I like it more the longer I've spent away from it, and I'm less bothered by these kind of small details that bothered me when I was working on it. I thought I'd show some shots of how I look while I'm inking, including my nervous glancing at the viewfinder. I haven't decided yet how much of myself I want to show, so I'm just kind of experimenting with the footage at the moment. But I think it's nice to show an artist at work. I really like seeing how people look when they're absorbed in things, and I often have to turn the page a lot here to find the right angle. And I also have to clean the nib a lot, which you can see right here. That's to make sure the ink isn't drying and clogging up the nib, otherwise it will completely affect the flow of the ink. Now to fill in the background. This is a very time-consuming part of my process, but it's actually one of my favourite parts of inking. It is incredibly time-consuming, but it can also be very relaxing. I like to listen to podcasts and music while I do this. It depends on how much I need to concentrate. I think for this one, I did have to think quite a lot about the blades of grass and where they should be placed and in what direction they would be flowing or which ones would be overlapping and how heavy or dense to make the foliage. The only time I don't like to fill backgrounds is if I need to finish a piece quickly. Then it feels incredibly long and arduous and you just know it's going to take forever. In retrospect, I do wish I had inked the grass here a bit differently. I don't hate what I created here, but looking back at past pieces, I think I prefer it when the blades of grass are more separated by solid or mostly solid black ink spaces without grass. It looks less realistic, but I don't think realism is really exactly what I'm going for. I think compositionally it works a bit better in my past pieces, but I do still like how this piece looks. It's just a kind of, I think it's more, either it's down to personal preference or it's just a kind of personal criticism I have of this piece that perhaps other people wouldn't be so bothered by. Plants feature heavily in my work, and I often look up the meanings and symbolism of plants before deciding which ones to add into my drawings. This can mean the process takes much longer, but I think it really enriches my pieces. I think even if people looking don't know the specific meaning of what's being placed in the image, I really think they can sense the weight of that research and thoughtfulness in a piece. I think something about doing that really reflects. I think sometimes when we don't think about those things, we tend to maybe reach towards maybe more cliche choices, and there is nothing wrong with being cliche, but I think if you want your piece to have a bit more depth to it, it can be a really good to do that bit of extra research or just putting some extra thought into deciding what kind of objects or things or plants or animals you want to place around your subject. And you often end up adding something you would have never usually have thought of. So I think it's a really lovely thing to do, and also just a way of adding more repertoire to your drawing skill as well. You might not have known how to draw orchids before, and now you do because you've looked up the reference and you've learnt how to draw them. Saying that though, balance is important to me, and I don't like to overthink things too much. So the initial idea I have is often very spontaneous, and I'll sketch it out in my sketchbook, and I'll usually be inspired by a subject, or for this I just liked the idea of rabbits feasting on a girl, and that was the idea, and then afterwards I think I prefer to go in and add more symbolism to the piece, and that's just how I work best. I have the strong visual idea first, and then I will often think of other ways to express it. This piece, I just remembered, looked very differently when I first had the idea. So here I thought it would be nice to change the camera angle to mix things up a bit, but it turned out my hand was covering the piece for the majority of the time, so I decided just to show the parts where you can see the nib work. At this point the lens is different. It changed a little while back and you can see the image is a bit sharper, and I think it just suits the inking work much better. These little bits of filling in the background are really satisfying, seeing how they all become slowly, very slowly, come together and the subject starts to pop out. If you're ever interested in seeing any footage of me talking through my sketchbook, I have a separate sketchbook I use where I plan out and catalogue or express any small ideas that I have. So I create lots of thumbnails, and that's where my ideas are born, basically. This sketchbook is very precious to me. It's basically a creative diary. The drawings aren't particularly good, but they are completely full of my ideas and I guess a part of my process, and a very important part of my process. Another day of inking. So at this point my workspace is quite ugly, and I would like you to know that I have since completely redone my workspace and it is very pretty now, and it has made me so happy. So I'm hoping soon I'll have some videos of my much prettier workspace with a really lovely dark wooden table. But for now I'm on this very ugly plastic grey table with, for some reason, yellow lines. Interesting design choice. So this piece has rabbits. I really love animals. I particularly love wild animals, and I like farm animals as well. Well, it really depends on the farm, obviously. This is a whole topic. But where I live, there's a lot of just fields of sheep and goats, and they have a lot of freedom, and I just really like seeing animals just be animals. I don't know if that makes sense. Just where they are meant to be in a field munching on grass, and I really love seeing it when sheep play with each other, when you see them running through a field. I don't know, it just makes me happy. So this piece has rabbits in it, as you can see, and I have over the years just become really charmed by rabbits. They are such beautiful animals, and I occasionally see them here. I live in a forest. I sometimes see them. They're very, very shy though, and since living in nature so much, and I live very much in the middle of a forest, this might seem like a really obvious observation, but I think it's easy to forget when you're not exposed to nature. But nature is really brutal, but there is a kind of beauty to it, and I think just it is how it is meant to be, and there is something very calming for me about being in a space that is like that, surrounded by nature, and how sometimes some really incredible things can be happening and you have absolutely no idea, because so many animals are so quiet and so silent. I just remember looking up one day and there was this huge eagle just flying above me, and I thought, I wonder how often that happens, and I have no idea. There are often these beautiful and very brutal things happening in nature that we're just completely unaware of. So I'm very interested in folklore, and I have read quite a few books about folklore, and I am often just looking up things online. Like I said, I enjoy looking up the symbolism of things that I want to put within my art. And I did look up some rabbit folklore, and I found a nice website with an article called 3 Hairs by Jackie Morris, and the website is windling.typepad.com. And they have an article here talking about quite a well-known symbol of 3 hairs in a circle. And they had a really nice quote here that I wanted to read out that really kind of expresses my feelings towards the symbolism of rabbits, even though I didn't know this was the symbolism. I think sometimes we get a sense of what things mean even if we don't know, just because of the way they're used in media and art across centuries and centuries, and I really liked this description. In numerous traditions, these animals were archetypal symbols of women, femininity, female deities, and women's hedgerow magic, associated with the lunar cycle, fertility, longevity, and rebirth. If we dig a little deeper into their stories, we find that they are also contradictory, paradoxical creatures, symbols of both cleverness and foolishness, of femininity and androgyny, of cowardice and courage, of rampant sexuality and virginal purity. In some lands, hair is the messenger of the great goddess, moving by moonlight between the human world and the realm of the gods. In other lands, he is God himself, wily deceiver and sacred world creator rolled into one. The association of rabbits, hares, and the moon can be found in numerous cultures the world over, ranging from Japan to Mexico, from Indonesia to the British Isles, whereas in Western folklore we refer to the man in the moon, and the hare or rabbit in the moon is a more familiar image in other societies. In China, for example, the hare in the moon is depicted with a mortar and pestle, in which he mixes the elixir of immortality. He is the messenger of a female moon deity and the guardian of all wild animals. So this top background part of the piece is actually my favourite part of the piece, other than the subject. So I'm drawing a type of flower here called a snapdragon, and actually I didn't know the name of these flowers until I managed to just do a lot of searching online and find them. I went to a beautiful place with my parents, actually were visiting me, and I saw these flowers that I really loved that were outside all of the cafes, and they were so beautiful. They kind of reminded me of foxgloves in the way that all the flowers run down the stalk, and they were very colourful, but they were not foxgloves. And my mum said, oh, my grandmother used to call those rabbits. And she said it's because when you turn the flower upside down, they look like a rabbit, like a little rabbit's face. And you can't really tell from looking at my drawing here. But if you look up snapdragons, you'll see what I mean. And because this isn't folklore symbolism, but I just really I had really loved this flower, and I had seen it recently, and I really loved this story. And so I wanted to put the flowers into this piece, because there were rabbits in this piece, and I just really loved the story. I really loved the image of a little girl sitting and playing with flowers because they look like rabbits' faces. I now start filling in the background at the top, and this, again, it's very time consuming, and because I really liked how this turned out, the initial ink drawing of the flowers, I enjoyed it even more, and I think it looks really lovely with the really dark background, and I was just really pleased with how this turned out. When I'm filling in the background, I don't worry too much about it being too perfect, so it doesn't have to be a completely solid black. I find it actually looks better if it's not, because that kind of imitates how plants really do look. Even if they're in the shadows, you can still see parts of the plant. So I'm careful not to overdraw onto the subjects, but I'm not too careful about it having to be a perfectly solid black. And I love leaving the edges unlined, so I don't put a hard border on most of my illustrations. I really like leaving it unlined. I think it gives a really beautiful effect. So now I am doing something called stippling, and this is basically where you create lots of tiny dots in ink. And some people create entire pieces using this technique. I decided that I wanted to fill the rest of this background with stippling because I really love how it looks, and it looks almost like lots of tiny stars, or like that when sunlight shines through a room and you can see all the dust in the air, it gives that kind of a feeling for me. It is incredibly time consuming, more time consuming than the other background filling I've been doing. Some people do create entire pieces with stippling. I prefer to use a combination of textures to create a whole piece. I used to primarily do painting, and I do wonder if it's something to do with having that experience of painting that makes me enjoy adding lots of different textures to my pieces, and I love kind of creating a gradient and filling them all together. But as I'm finishing the final corner here, I can tell you my hand was definitely incredibly stiff, but it's very satisfying to do, and if you're just filling in a background like that, you don't have to think too much, so it can be quite nice as well, quite relaxing. So now I filled the background, I go in and add the details to the main subject and to the rabbits. I do the background first, so I fill in the background, because in the past I found if I added the details first, I would often overshade the main subject and they would kind of melt into the background. I would add too much ink and they wouldn't stand out enough from the dark background. So now that I know how dark I've inked the background, I have a much better sense of how much or how little shade or how much detail I want to add to the hair and the body. Adding in the line detail to the hair was honestly quite frustrating. I couldn't quite manage to get the effect I wanted on all of the hair, but I am still quite happy with how this turned out. I added some more carefree lines to the hair afterwards just to give a bit more movement. Sometimes I do worry a bit that my pieces look a bit stiff, so often I go in afterwards and add some more kind of carefree lines so it doesn't look too stiff. But also I find sometimes things need like a harder black line gone back over the subject just so it pops out more from the background. And here I'm adding just a couple of spontaneous lines to the image. So I actually turned off the camera for a while and I did a bit of inking off camera, so I filled in her eyes. It's because I got frustrated with the hair and it wasn't quite doing what I wanted, and this is the first kind of inked piece I'd ever filmed. And I think in future I would like to try pushing through and carrying on filming even if I am frustrated. But I thought her eyes would look better dark, and I think they do. I really like how they look when I had finished inking them. I'm sorry I didn't catch that on camera, but I was just a bit overwhelmed with the process and getting a bit annoyed. But I think it really helps them to pop out from the other details in the hair. I also went off camera and added more shadow under her arms and hands to create more depth. I often do that, even after I filled in a background, I'll go in and add some darker shades. I think I was a bit out of practice. It had been a really long time since I had actually inked a piece. I had actually gotten quite burnt out from inking a year ago. I was basically like a human printer, which was amazing for a while because I created a lot of work and I really built up my portfolio. But if you do too much of one thing and you don't kind of pay attention to how you're feeling, or if you're kind of overworking, it can take some of the joy out of it, which is such a shame. Like, it's quite sad because creating art really brings me so much happiness, and I really do love creating ink pieces. I had actually created an illustrated short story that I had self-published, which you can actually find in my shop if you are interested. The book is hand bound, it is hand cut, it is digitally printed in black and white, and it is a fairy story or a folklore kind of story I wrote, a dark kind of fairy tale story, and it really marked the beginning of just a new kind of passion and not exactly a new style, but it really solidified the kind of work I wanted to make, and I'm hoping to create more illustrated stories in the future. So I'm now going in and just really refining any lines, I'm removing any pencil marks, I'm adding some stippling to add light and shadows on the skin, adding fur details to the rabbits, which you saw, and I'm adding shading to the flowers and some final touches to the hair. And all of these things really bring the piece together and really make it feel finished. It's definitely the shading of the subject that can be quite tricky. It can be a little bit hard to know how much to do, because I want the subject to feel real or like 3D, so it needs some shading, but I try and keep it quite minimal. And this is the finished piece. I really hope you enjoyed watching this and joining me while I inked the first piece I have done in a very long time. I would really love it if you could subscribe. If you want to see more videos like this and other art projects I will be sharing. I also have an online shop with pieces like this one for sale as prints. I have a self-published illustrated storybook, and one day I'm hoping to also have some dolls that will be sold in my shop too. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed.